Hello, and welcome to Central Booking, where writers and readers are the authority. I'm your host, John Valeri. Today, I have the pleasure and privilege of being in conversation with my friend, bestselling author Meghan Holloway. Meghan is the author of Hiding Place, the second book in her critically acclaimed suspense trilogy set in Ravens Gap, Montana. The series features Hector Lewis, a rough around the edges policeman who will stop at nothing to find out what happened to his wife and daughter, both of whom disappeared 15 years ago. Having come to mysteries by way of Nancy Drew, Meghan grew up to earn an undergraduate degree in creative writing and a master's of library and information science. She once fought crime in the records section of a police department and currently works as a scientist. Meghan's first novel, Once More Unto the Breach, is a historical thriller set against the backdrop of World War II and recently became a bestseller. Earlier this year, she published a futuristic love story, The Library of Lost Souls, and even recorded an author's note for the audio version. Hiding Place is the follow-up to last year's Hunting Ground, which introduced Hector Lewis and two women on the run, Evelyn and Faye Anders, all of whom became connected by a serial killer terrorizing the community of Ravens Gap. In this new entry, Faye's past catches up with her and young son Sam, while Hector makes shocking discoveries about his wife and what may have led to her disappearance. New York Times bestselling author Alison Brennan enthused, tightly written and intense, Hiding Place is a thoroughly suspenseful mystery that you'll want to read in one sitting. Meghan Holloway is a writer to watch. I couldn't agree more. And the good news is you can watch Meghan right now. Of course, you're going to want to grab a copy of her book immediately, and then find a hiding place of your own while you hunker down and read it. Hey everybody, welcome back to Central Booking. Today I am in conversation with best-selling author, we can say that now, best-selling author Meghan Holloway, whose new book, Hiding Place, comes out August 10th from Polis Books. Welcome to the show, Meghan.
Thank you so much for having me, John. I'm excited to be here.
I am excited to have you here. So I enjoy calling you a best-selling author. That's new. Like that just happened, and it's really terrific. So
last week, it's been really exciting.
Kudos to you. And double exciting. You're a best-selling author, and you have a brand new book coming out. As I mentioned, Hiding Place. I'm just going to keep flashing the cover. That's very subtle, right? By this book.
It's honestly one of my favorite covers. I was so impressed with the design. I just thought it turned out beautifully, and that blue is so haunting.
Yeah, it's gorgeous, and it really captures the tone. Like you can look at the cover and get an understanding of how you're going to feel reading the book. So first thing we're going to do, we're going to step into my virtual elevator or my cyber elevator, whatever this is, and I'm just going to give you a quick opportunity to sort of give us the quick elevator pitch for this book to give people a flavor of what they can expect.
Yeah, absolutely. So Hector Lewis has reached a dead end seeking answers to the disappearance of his wife and daughter 15 years ago. Faye Anders is a woman on the run in hiding. When her son goes missing on a school field trip, she and Hector cross paths with an ambitious man who has ties to both of their pasts. And when the past comes knocking, there's no place to hide.
That was very well done. I'm always impressed when people can break it down that succinctly and yet make it compelling. So good on you. So before we really, get into the nuts and bolts of the books, and I promise it will be non-spoilery, but I wanted to ask you first just about the idea of this series, because it is conceived as a trilogy. So Hunting Ground came out last year. That was book one. This is book two. There will be a third book. So let me ask you about that. How do you see this story is working? One is a standalone for readers who may not have read the first book, but then also as a continuation of the overall sort of series arc that you've developed.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's this overarching plot that follows Hector's journey toward redemption and retribution throughout the whole trilogy. He's grappling with the disappearance of his wife and daughter so many years ago. He's seeking answers, and he's dealing with the suspicion that has fallen on him for the last 15 years. That's really the thread that ties the whole series together. But in each story, I've tried to have a mystery contained within. A mystery that both furthers Hector's quest, and then it also gives readers another perspective to engage with, another personal drama to unfold. And the epilogues have honestly been some of my favorite scenes to write with these stories, because I wrap things up, not neatly, but with enough closure for you to be satisfied. And then I try to give readers a hint of a teaser for what's coming next.
Sure. I love that. And I wanted to ask you too, so I'm going off script. This did not take me long at all, but you can handle it. I just wanted to ask, I feel like when you're writing a trilogy, book two is probably the hardest book in the sense that, it has to bridge the first and the third books. So you have to, tie things together, but you also need a lead in to the finale. And I've been following you on social media and, I'm watching your progression with the next book that you're writing, which I'm assuming may be book three in this. So I'm just wondering, what was your experience like with writing book two in comparison to book one and what you're writing now?
Book one, Hunting Ground, was certainly the easiest to write because I was setting the stage for this story. And I think that's an accurate assessment that book two is this challenging bridge that you're trying to build, where you're trying to keep readers invested. You're trying to grow your readership and bring new readers into the trilogy, and then also set the stage for that last story. And I will say, the last book in the trilogy, there's a lot of expectation with it. And so emotionally, I'm most concerned about readers reading that third book and feeling like it was a satisfying conclusion. But the second book, Hiding Place, was definitely a challenge to write and a challenge to nail the tone of it really well.
Sure. Well, let me tell you, I think you succeeded brilliantly. It's funny, but sometimes when I, read book two of what I know is a trilogy, I almost enter it with a bit of trepidation just because a lot of times, I felt like there have been books, they either get bogged down in backstory or they're just kind of floundering because they don't know how to connect the two. But this was really, really well done and really action oriented. It was almost sort of different tonally than the first book. Not that a lot of things did not happen there, but it really grabs you from the very beginning and it kind of never lets you go.
Thank you. I tell people, Hunting Ground was really my scariest book that I wrote in this trilogy. And Hiding Place has been the most action-packed. And then Killing Field is probably the most introspective and the most sorrowful.
That's interesting. And I do have to say, for Hunting Ground, I remember when I read it and I like being scared, and I'm one of those people that, I read scary books, I watch scary movies, and I usually just laugh because you get to a point where nothing really scares you anymore. Right. But there are two scenes in that book that I found really, really disturbing, but in a good way. And I kind of like stood up and applauded you in my house because it takes a lot to get that sort of visceral reaction from me, of all people, and you did it twice.
Oh, thank you. I honestly scared myself a little in several of those scenes. I think I know the exact scenes you're talking about, and I had a few chills writing them.
Yeah, it was great. They were almost like jump scares if you were going to compare it to a movie.
Yes.
And speaking of Hunting Ground, I did want to ask you, returning readers are going to wonder about Evelyn, who is the protagonist of the last book. And she does play a very important role in this book as well, but it's a bit more periphery. So can you talk about, how the events of that book weigh on the characters and circumstances in this book, and also how shifting focal points between characters as the series progresses keeps things fresh for you?
Yeah, I loved weaving Evelyn back into this story because she's one of my favorite characters that I've written. And the characters in Hiding Place are still really grappling with the ripple effects of the events of Hunting Ground. In Hunting Ground, a serial killer was living and preying upon women in their midst. And that's, I think, a very traumatic event, not only for those immediately involved, but also for a community as a whole. One of the things I loved about writing a trilogy with different characters is having a different female perspective come in with each story, and you're able to see Hector and these other characters from various perspectives. It was so much fun to step back from Evelyn after Hunting Ground and see her from the viewpoint of Faye in Hiding Place. And I think that creates a really interesting juxtaposition for readers who are familiar with Evelyn from the first story and know all of her secrets when Faye doesn't. So I thought that was a lot of fun to write.
It's refreshing to read too. I'm always surprised that more people don't take that approach. But I kind of like it because it keeps things fresh. And like you said, you do get to see characters that you think that you know really, really well, and then you see them through different eyes, which is fun. So I wanted to ask you too about Hector Lewis, because he really is at the heart of this whole trilogy. And he's an interesting character because he's not, likable in the normal sense, but he has, redeeming qualities. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, his backstory, how that makes him sympathetic and relatable, and also, how you approach developing this character so that readers are invested in him sort of despite his flaws.
Hector was such a fascinating character to write, and you really get to know him in layers in these stories. And it's not until the third book that he really opens up to the reader and shares his full past with them. He's very much an example of that argument of nurture versus nature. And the character was very much an experiment for me in how far I could go with a character and readers still feel invested in his story. I love a good antihero, and I love a morally complex character who leaves readers a little appalled by their actions. And I love pushing myself as a writer, creating that type of character. And I also love that flip side of challenging a reader with that type of character. It's a really fine balance to try to achieve, but I hope I was able to do so with this character. I wanted there to be that conflict of readers understanding why he does what he does, but still grimacing and thinking, my God, Hector, that was reprehensible.
He's a great character. It's like there's always more to be unboxed, but I've really grown to like him. He makes you raise your eyebrows at times, but good. And so let me ask you too, you were talking about him being an experimental character, but I wanted to ask you about a specific aspect of Hector and also Faye, because they're both really strong parental figures in their own way. You mentioned, Hector has lost his wife and daughter. They've gone missing and he's still trying to resolve that issue. And then there's Faye, who's really very protective of Sam. So I'm wondering, not having children of your own, can you talk about capturing the emotional and sort of physical realities of what it means to be a parent, because that is so critical to these books and it sort of gives the emotional center to them.
It really is. And I started with portraying a parental figure in my World War II story, Once More Into the Breach, with having this very deep father-son bond. And this is my first story where I have explored motherhood. When I think about the emotion and the bond, particularly of motherhood, I consider how I felt helping raise a child in my late teens and early 20s. When I was in college and immediately after, I was a nanny for a time for a little girl from the time she was 7 weeks old until she went to kindergarten. And I would have died to protect her without thinking twice about doing so. And to be honest, I feel the same way about my standard poodle. I would kill for him and I would die for him with no hesitation. And that vehement level of emotion is so fascinating to me. And it's something I tried to channel with writing Faye. She's so ferocious. And she also has this wonderful tumult of conflict with feeling like motherhood is this incredibly weighty responsibility, and then also feeling like it's a burden. And as an outsider, as someone who is not a mother, and observing people with children, that's honestly how the relationship has always struck me: a responsibility, a gift, but also very much a burden at times. Hector's quite a bit different in that he never wanted to be a father. He never actively participated in being a parent. And now that his daughter's gone, he feels this loss so acutely and grapples with how uninvolved and uninterested he was in being a father. As for the physical realities, I think you'll appreciate this, John. There's this scene in Hiding Place in which Faye is carrying Sam. He's 8 years old and she's running. And as I was writing the scene, I just was not sure that everything that was happening was physically possible. So I call up a friend of mine who has a 9-year-old daughter. And I said, hey, may I come over and borrow your child for an experiment for my novel? And thankfully, my friend is great. And she's like, yeah, absolutely. Come on over.
Wow, that's some real hands-on research.
Yes. Her daughter was absolutely delighted to have me carry her at a run, trying to act out these evasive maneuvers. It was hard, but it was doable. And so I took my research very seriously on that end.
And I felt for her. I mean, she was really struggling at times in this book, but she never stops. Um, that's really interesting. I would not have ever thought to ask you, if you were lugging somebody else's child around to test the feasibility. But kudos to you, because that is doing your due diligence.
There we go.
And I'm going to come back to Faye in a minute, but I did want to ask you something else about Hector, because you were talking about, though you don't have children of your own, you have a dog that you love and are very protective of. And I should just say, if you're not following Meghan on social media, you really should, because there are just wonderful pictures of Aiden. So I will drop all of her social handles in the video description. But now coming back to my question, if I can remember it, I wanted to ask you, because Hector may not have the best social graces with people, but he himself has a poodle named Frank and has sort of very heartening interactions with Frank, and also Faye's son Sam. So I'm just wondering if you can talk about those moments and how they sort of reveal facets of Hector's character that we might not otherwise see.
Oh, Frank, he is one of my favorite characters. And Frank has really always been this touchstone for Hector's humanity. He has been this figure throughout the stories that is meant to show you that even though the reader, and even though Hector himself may disagree, he is capable of compassion, of caring for someone other than himself. And the trilogy is really about this evolution of Hector's character. In the first book, you saw him being completely willing to use others for his own agenda with no regard whatsoever to their safety. And in this second story, you see him at least recognizing that behavior and feeling some, however slight, level of remorse and responsibility for those that he puts in harm's way. With the character of Sam, you see him a little less willing to use a child for his own machinations. Not entirely unwilling, of course, but he at least thinks about it in this story.
Yes, he does think twice. And then you say, all right, look at that. That is character growth from the first book. So I wanted to come back to Faye for a minute, too, because, she's really had to live her life on the run and sort of off the grid. So can you talk about what the challenges are of depicting that kind of situation believably when, as a society, we're sort of inundated with technology and surveillance that's become very kind of pervasive?
This was honestly one of the most challenging aspects of the story. And I know just from personal experience, from having worked in the records department of a police department, there is so much incredible technology and ways of solving crimes and finding people these days. There's so many databases that you can search. It's just astronomical. And I wanted to have her living life in a community, but off the grid. And that's really impossible these days with the way that technology is. So my workaround for that, my solution for that, was to have her disappear into plain sight, having her change her identity so she's still living, albeit in a very different setting from what she's used to, but then she's doing so in hiding. And it's one of the reasons I chose the setting I did, a small town outside of Yellowstone, where the cell service is spotty, the people are suspicious, and it's kind of a situation where what happens in Raven's Gap stays in Raven's Gap.
Yeah, one way or another. And let me ask you about Raven's Gap, which is Montana, borders Yellowstone National Park. These books really are very atmospheric, which I love, because, you feel like the setting becomes its own character within the story, because you realize that the story wouldn't necessarily work as well somewhere else. But can you talk about how you view the setting as enhancing your narratives, both atmospherically, but sort of also thematically with the story that you're telling?
Yellowstone is honestly one of my favorite places here in the States. And I've wanted to write a story set in that ecosystem for years because it's such a fascinating area of the country. And it's really still largely wilderness, very rugged, very untamed. And there's this element of lawlessness, even in this modern era. With the setting being very much a character in and of itself, I've tried to use that environment throughout the series as a foil for the characters, whether that was working against the characters in some way or exposing an element of that character's nature.
Sure. And I wanted to come back to sort of a recurring theme that's carried through the first couple books, which is, how women are often marginalized or victimized, yet they also show that strength can be found in what others might perceive as vulnerabilities. So I'm wondering if you can talk about the ways that this allows you to explore the realities of crime, particularly against women or children, but while also providing moments of empowerment and redemption for these characters.
I think that's a fantastic question. I always strive to write very resourceful, clever women who take matters into their own hands and who are fully capable of saving themselves. But the truth is, we live in a violent world and women and children are vulnerable. And those who are vulnerable are the ones who are preyed upon. I was reading some statistics recently, and there is a study that shows that 1 in 4 women have experienced intimate partner violence in their lifetime. Around 19 million women in the US have been stalked in their lifetime. And the WHO says that over 1 billion children worldwide between the ages of 2 and 17 have experienced violence or neglect in the last year. Native women living on tribal lands in America are murdered at an extremely high rate. It's honestly heartbreaking. In some communities, it's more than 10 times the national average. So unfortunately, for many women and many children, experiencing violence is the norm. It's part of their daily lives. And what I really strive to show in my stories is that even if women have been victimized, it was a box that was checked on a police report. It's not the core of who they are.
Sure. And that was actually, I think, one of the most interesting elements of the first book. You got the statistics about Native American women and the victimization and the cover-up of crime. And it was really kind of astounding. So, people who want to learn more about that should certainly pick up the first book as well. So now we're going to switch gears, I guess, into a little bit broader territory, if you don't mind.
I don't.
I knew you wouldn't. Thank you. You're so flexible. You just go with it. But I wanted to ask you, you not only have written these 2 books, but you have written a best-selling historical novel, Once More Unto the Breach, and also a futuristic love story, The Library of Lost Souls. So what appeals to you about writing across genres? And then, conversely, is it difficult to balance sort of your interests and aspirations with the fact that, we sort of want to put you in a box and brand you so that people know, when they pick up a Meghan Holloway that they're going to get this and not that, which I think is a constant struggle for people these days.
I think it is as well. And developing a brand is so key for authors. It's something I'm constantly striving for. But I do wonder, in this day and age, does your brand have to be defined by a very strict genre label? And what I've aimed for in these stories that I've told across genres is to have a very distinct style and a distinct voice that readers can trust to deliver a very moving and impactful story. But, I could be wrong about that theory that you can write in whatever genre and readers will come. But this is all an experiment and exploration. I'm really settling into telling the stories that speak most to me. So I think I will hone in on more particular genres in the next years as I write more books.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I was, sort of thinking about this because virtual book buying has become, so much more popular. And so there's not really the issue of wandering into a bookstore anymore. And, people have to wonder what shelf to, stock you on. Readers have to wonder where to find you because that doesn't matter, as much online. But it's just interesting to see how things fall out. But I like, that you follow the stories that really speak to you. And I think that that's probably why they resonate so strongly with those of us who read them, regardless of the genre. So thank you for that perspective. And so now we're really going to go back in time. I'm going to take you back because we have this in common. So your love of mystery began when you discovered Nancy Drew, and mine did too. And I always thought I was going to marry her. And then people are like, you do know that she's a fictional character in books and doesn't really exist in the real world. I still have trouble, wrapping my mind around that. But
Yes, I was quite smitten with Ned.
yeah, as many people were, but I was wondering, can you tell us a bit about how your reading life has informed your writing life, and also why you think it is that so many of us are drawn to the who done it, how done it, why done it type of book?
I was a reader long before I was a writer, and being a reader is what shaped me into a storyteller. I think we're drawn to those whodunits, whydunits for the same reason that many people love fantasy. It puts a shape to the things that frighten us and that wound us, and it allows us to vanquish those horrors on the page. Unlike in fantasy, the whodunit is based in reality. The murderer is your unassuming next door neighbor, not a literal monster. And I think that's more frightening, but I also think that perhaps it's all the more satisfying when that figurative monster is brought to justice in the end.
Sure. Thank you for that perspective. It's always interesting to, ask people why these kind of books appeal, because they do tend to be dark and lots of terrible things happen, but that's
Yes.
sort of life. We've all lived it. And, you mentioned Ned Nickerson, and this is just a little aside here, but you say that, and then I'm like, oh, I remember I always used to be like kind of jealous of him because, of course it was Nancy's boyfriend and he played football. I do not play football. But hey, all right, I digress. I do that a lot. So, all right, we might be opening Pandora's box here, but I also want to ask you, about sort of right-sided, left-sided brain thinking, because a lot of people will argue, that you're one or the other. You're either sort of mathematically and scientifically minded or you're more creatively minded, but you are inclined to both. You are a scientist, you do numbers, you understand numbers, unlike some of us, but obviously you're a very creative person as well, because you tell stories that are based on reality, but they're fiction. So can you talk a bit about how you see both sides of your brain sort of working together, how that informs your approach to writing, and what your thought is, in being both scientifically and mathematically inclined, but also a very creative person as well?
I think people tend to draw these distinctions between the sciences and the arts, logic and creativity, when it's more appropriate to view them as two sides of the same coin. There is art to the sciences and there's science to the arts. And I approach my work in a very exacting manner. I don't believe in a muse and I don't believe in writer's block. I believe in ruthlessly carving out time for my craft and making it happen. Determination, productivity, those are the things that get a book written. And everyone has their different processes for what that determination and that productivity look like. For me, I sit down at my desk every morning and I write a specific number of words every day. That number varies based on the book that I'm writing, how much research is involved, how heavy my workload is with my day job. But I get a set amount of words in every day. And I honestly treat my art like it's a job.
That's terrific. And I really like too how you describe that as the right side and left side of the brain being sort of flip sides of the coin. And I think I've just realized that nobody ever turned over the coin. So, my creative side is flipped up and nobody's seen the mathematical or scientific kind. But also, I think, what you said is very poignant about making the time to write, carving out the time. I was talking to somebody the other night, and her advice to people is there's never going to be the perfect situation in which to write. So if you expect that, you're kind of screwed. But can you talk a little bit about, I know that you're a very disciplined person, and following you on social media, we can see that you sort of use targeting tools so that you know when you're hitting your mark. So can you talk a little more about that and how it benefits you and how it might benefit other people who have trouble keeping, track of what their goal or their deadline is?
I am all about plotting a novel up into a certain point. I will outline the major turning points in the story, but I leave myself a lot of room for creativity so that I'm not stifled. But I do have this set process. I have this certain hour that I block out every morning. I don't get on social media during that time. I spend it writing and getting in that word count that I aim for every day. There are any number of word processing tools that you can use. I love Scrivener. There's a lot of, I am a librarian at heart, and so I love organization, and Scrivener has some phenomenal organization and project targeting tools built into it.
That's excellent. I feel a sense of accomplishment every time I say that you've met your goal on social media.
I do too.
It's a great way to, hold yourself accountable. And I guess even more so when other people are paying attention to it, but that's terrific. So I also wanted to ask you, and people can look this up. I know that recently you wrote an article about a script writing class that you took and how that sort of taught you the rules of writing, because you know that you wanted to write and that you could write, you just weren't exactly sure how to put it all together. So can you talk about what your key takeaways were from that course, and then how you adapted them to crafting novels, which is still sort of its own discipline?
That script writing course was really the first step in realizing that I loved to write, but I didn't know the rules for writing. And I studied the craft in various forms beyond script writing and absolutely fell in love with the study of writing itself. Picasso once said, learn the rules like a pro so you can break them like an artist. And I tried to take that to heart and study the written word, understand all of the mechanics of storytelling before I ever began experimenting with my own tales.
I like that. That's a good way to not really write yourself into too many corners, right?
Yeah.
All right. So, I have to ask you this, coming back to advice, and I've started to ask everybody this question. So in terms of a creative life, or more specifically, a writing life, on reflection, what is the best advice that you think that you've ever gotten? And then also the best advice that you've never gotten and had to learn yourself throughout the process of writing?
Oh, those are both really good questions. I would say the best advice I ever received on writing was from a professor in college when I asked him if the story I was working on was, and he told me that exploring the darkness of humanity was the best way to understand and portray the power of hope and good and light. And then he handed me a tattered collection of Flannery O'Connor short stories and told me to read her work, that it would help me understand what I was doing with my own. And he was right. I also don't think it's an overstatement to say that reading Flannery O'Connor changed my life in the way that I wrote. As for the best advice I had to learn for myself, I think it's that the writer never has the clearest view of his or her own work. They're always too close to see what the story needs, where the weak spots are. And I have learned over the course of my career that it's so key to be open to constructive criticism.
That's excellent advice. And I think that I think this is episode 67, and I don't think anybody's actually given that specific piece of advice before. And, very true. And looking back in my brief forays into fiction, everything I think is great, people tell me is terrible. Everything I think sucks, they say, no, this is the best thing you've ever done. So there you go. And anyway, final question for you. Since we've talked all about what you've already written, can you tell us a bit more about what you're writing now? So I know there's, Hector #3 coming down the pike, but is there anything beyond that you're sort of grappling with at this moment?
Well, the next book is a final installment in the Hector Lewis trilogy. We'll be returning to Raven's Gap next year with Killingfield. What can I tell you about that story right now? I would break it down like this. Wildfire season has engulfed Yellowstone in flames, and Raven's Gap is in the crosshairs. As the tension and the heat escalate, the truth becomes clear that betrayal lies far closer to home than Hector could have ever imagined. As for what's next, I really can't say yet. Everything's still under wraps and still in the works.
sure, it's percolating. All right. Well, in the meantime, people have to pick up Hiding Place. It is terrific. You won't be able to put it down. Meghan Holloway, Hiding Place, out August 10th from Polis Books. Thank you so much.
Yes, of course. Thank you, John.
It's my pleasure. That's it for this episode of Central Booking. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a thing.